Super Mario Bros. Hits theaters. Blast processing brings Sega to the next level. And id shows off Doom. These stories and many more on this episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Requiescat in pace.
Makes him crazy, man. What is a man?
It's me, Mario.
What a mess.
Get over here!
Please save me.
Welcome back to the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine, the show where we travel back in time to find out what was making headlines in the home computer and video game industries of yesteryear. My name is Carl, and today we're going to be heading back 30 years to May of 1993, and I'm joined again by everybody's favorite co-host, Alex.
Hey,
Welcome back to the show, Alex.
Good to be here.
As always. So, obligatory podcast banter. What you been up to since last week?
Yeah, geez, it only has been 1 week. Not much, question mark? I said that last time, and then I was like, had to be like, oh, and by the way, not much, and I also saw Dawn Bluth, so I may be lying to you.
And you got married. So
well, yeah, but I mean, that had happened like over a month ago. I mean, this has just been a week this time. I haven't had that much chance to get into more trouble.
That's true. So, let's see. No more trouble. You finally released your episode on Will Wright.
Part one, yes.
Part one, yes. That was a really good listen. I enjoyed that.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, especially his quirky upbringing. I mean, it did bring a lot of his design philosophies into a slightly more, into a better context.
Yeah,
I understood it a bit better.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I've been proud of in the more recent They Create Worlds, and by more recent, I mean, 20, 30, 40 episodes at this point. We've done a lot of episodes, but we've been really trying to explore a lot of the wider context around our subjects, as well as the subjects themselves. And, sometimes there's more to say on broader context than other times, but I do think the Will Wright episode in particular was a good one for being able to do that.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, just understanding where he was coming from, what his financial situation was, the fact that he wasn't under this constant pressure, I've got to make this game, I've got to get it out in order to make money.
Yeah.
Allowed for the experimentation that other creators simply would not have had the luxury of.
Absolutely.
And that makes a huge difference.
Yep, so we'll be doing part 2 at the beginning of July, which will largely be focused on The Sims, of course, with a little bit of the surrounding games as well.
Oh, yeah. Everything that has Sim in a title.
Everything Will Wright did that has Sim in a title, because we're not doing a history of Maxis this time around. My friend Phil Salvador over at the Video Game History Foundation has been working for some time now on a history of Maxis that will be published in another couple of years, I think, by Limited Run Press. And he's been getting all of the dirt from all of the people on Maxis as a whole. So we really are focusing on Will Wright, the creator, and not the company that he founded or co-founded.
Gotcha. Well, I mean, and it makes a lot of sense because, yeah, they use that Sim. I mean, at least tell me Will Wright had nothing to do with Streets of SimCity.
To my knowledge, no, he did not.
Ah, good. I would have felt bad.
Yeah, SimCity, SimCity 2000, SimEarth, SimAnt, and SimCopter are, I believe, the only ones that he really had.
Oh, really? SimCopter?
Yes, that was him.
Interesting. Because I really would have put SimCopter and Streets of SimCity sort of in the brainchilds of the same entities. But, okay, that's cool. Sorry, yeah, so the Streets of SimCity, a wonderful idea had it been properly implemented.
However, I don't think any of this happened in May 1993, Carl.
No, this is true. May 1993. We have many, many stories to cover today, as per usual. So, everybody just remember, when we're talking about May of 1993, standard proviso, in case you have been listening to the podcast for a while, you know this spiel. We are using the cover dates of magazines and newspapers, and it's obvious that the news happened at some point before that. So please don't send me any emails. It's just a framing device to give us a rough chronological history. In addition to that, before we turn on the time machine, we do have to cover a couple of other things, like, for example, our first segment, the 7 Minutes in Heaven, where our intrepid co-host must play a game that was reviewed in a publication dated May of 1993, for 7 minutes that they have never played before.
And boy, do we have something perfectly cromulent for y'all today.
Oh, Jesus Christ, it already started. So, we could have gone with, well, I'm guessing you've played Star Fox, right?
Oh, yeah, I own Star Fox.
Okay.
I own Star Fox.
Damn Nintendo kids. We had Desert Strike on the Amiga, which many people consider to be the best version of the game. It's absolutely wonderful. The intro music is wonderful mod with spoken synth.
I also own
samples.
that one, but on Super NES, of course, not on Amiga.
That's a weak ass version of that game. But we're not gonna go into that. Okay. We had EA's great flop Xenobots. Or I think it was Ultra Bots in the States. It had two different names depending on where you were. We had Populous 2 on DOS, which was absolutely beautiful game. We had a bunch of Sega CD titles like Time Gal and CNC Music Factory. Now there would have been one to really spend some time with. Shadowrun on the Super Nintendo, Mech Warrior on the Super Nintendo. We had to go with a game that has been getting a lot of hype in the months leading up to its release, and I was surprised you had never played it, so this is perfect. It's, of course, Bubsy by Accolade. So,
Alex plays Bubsy. What could possibly go wrong, Carl?
Well, we're about to find out. So, if you want to watch Alex actually play Bubsy, you can, of course, become a Patreon member, and for $1 a month, get access to all the video versions of our 7 Minutes in Heaven segments, as well as early access to the interviews. Remember, links in the show notes. But if you just want to hear about it, well, Alex, are you ready to play some Bubsy?
Let's do it.
Excellent.
Go, Bubsy, go! He's got big ears. He's got big feet. And he's got a big mouth. Bubsy, now available on Sega Mega Drive. What could possibly go wrong?
Welcome back, Alex, from your 7 Minutes in Heaven. So, for the uninitiated, how would you describe Bubsy based on your 7 minutes with the game?
I would say that it is, as a platformer, at the end of the day, fine. It's mediocre. It's not great. Especially on the SNES, the frame rate is really janky. It's better to my understanding on the Genesis version. But the animations are really nice. The death animations in particular are kind of funny. The levels are laid out in a way to encourage some exploration. It's not Mario or Sonic, but it's also not Boogerman. So it has that going for it, which is nice. So, yeah, I would just say it's mediocre. If you want to see what all the fuss was about, this overhyped, underdelivered game with horrendous sequels, then, you know, you're not going to be killing yourself to play it for a few minutes. But it's definitely not essential that you go through life. If you go through life without ever having played it, you're going to be okay.
Okay, that's a good way to describe it. So now, I mean, Bubsy has a very specific historical importance, one might say, or it has become memeified in many regards, and as a standard bearer of a particular type of Me Too game of this era, trying to capture the lightning in a bottle that was Sonic the Hedgehog, sort of the anthropomorphic animal doing stuff. And I mean, it's obviously just one of those many out there at this, one of the many that will go down in history as part of the 16-bit catalog. But as far as I can tell, there's no other one other than Sonic out on the market at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. It really was first. And it gets its bad rap for a couple of reasons. And it's memed more in some of the historical communities I'm in, like Gaming Alexandria and Video Game History Foundation. I don't know that the wider world is memeing it so much, but it's kind of at the intersection of a couple of the things. It comes kind of at the beginning of this period of over-the-top ridiculous marketing of video games, something else that Sonic and Sega were pioneering. And also it comes right at the vanguard, as you said, of all of these Me Too mascot games. And so it was way overhyped. It was mediocre when it came out, which was fine, but it's just the hype made it seem like it would be the second coming of Mario and Sonic and, I don't know, Final Fantasy VII, which hadn't even been released yet. All in one. And it just wasn't that. And then, at the time, it didn't stand out as a Me Too game because it was kind of the first one. But then when you got everything that followed in its wake, then it just kind of got lumped in with all of these generic, usually animal-driven, run and jump platforming games and blah, blah, blah. And then you have to add to that fact that the sequels are truly, genuinely, and in the case of Bubsy 3D, horrifically terrible. And because of all that, it retrospectively gets a bad rap because people see the sequels, people see the over-top marketing, and they're like, this is just so ridiculous for such an awful game. And in truth, the first one is just fine. If it's the only Bubsy game that had ever been made, people would have been like, okay, whatever.
Well, and it's weird because the magazines at the time, I mean, all the magazine reviews I saw this month, and some of them will show up next month or so, they just went absolutely bonkers on how much they loved Bubsy.
They did.
I mean, and it's scary. I mean, there's a part of it where I guess it was a contrast to Mario because the graphics are a little bit more detailed. There's more shading, at least dithering in the graphics and stuff. I guess the idea of the hip character, the cool character, played a lot of role. I mean, a ton of the magazine reviews all talk about the great background story.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, that's in the manual. It has absolutely no impact on gameplay, apparently. At least not from what we saw.
They fell for the hype. That's the consensus today. I mean, it's not like I don't think anyone's asked any of these reviewers what happened, but I think they fell for the hype. And that's another reason, the over-the-top magazine reviews that it gets kind of pilloried today in retrospect, because it's like, oh, those crazy game journalists.
Yeah, and I guess it's when you're surrounded by the PR guys, playing it up. And also, you don't want to be the guy who reviewed the game saying this kind of sucks, and then it turns out to be an absolute classic. I mean, everybody goes back to those early reviews for Sid Meier's Pirates, or even, Super Mario Brothers, where they're like, what's this? And there are a few of those reviews out there, and, people that haunted them. So I guess, hey, yeah, this got to be good, right? Right? It's just fun. Oh, well. So, all things considered, would you recommend Bubsy to anybody?
I mean, I wouldn't recommend it, but I also wouldn't say stay the hell away from it. If you're curious, if you're like, I wonder why everyone always brings up this Busby game, then, go for it. I mean, you're not going to hate yourself at the end of your period of playing it, but I wouldn't say, oh, you've got to go play this game. I don't. It's not the best exemplar of what either the SNES or the Genesis can do. It's not the best exemplar of what a 16-bit platformer was. It's not even an exemplar of what a 16-bit animal mascot platformer was. It's just kind of forgettable at the end of the day.
Gotcha. So, shovelware, people. It's shovelware. By a company that really wasn't good at making console games.
And drove themselves to bankruptcy doing it, which wasn't so much about making the games, but it was more about the lawsuit that followed in the wake of making the games.
Yeah, and they could have just stuck with making more test drive games. That's really what they were good at. They should have stuck with that. Okay. So, moving on, we now need to check in with our good friend Ethan in the Department of Corrections to find out what I got wrong in our April 1993 episode.
Hello, this is a prepaid collect call from
the Department of Corrections.
This call is subject to recording and monitoring. To accept charges, press 1. You may start the conversation now.
Welcome back to the Department of Correction, or I should say I'm welcome back. Welcome back, Ethan.
Are you welcome, though?
I don't know. You tell me.
I have the welcome mat out front, so I guess you are.
Yay, I'm welcome. So, tell me, what is the John comment from our April 1993 episode?
John, choose your words more carefully, so that you do not say casual analist. You caught yourself and went back, but just be a bit more careful.
Excellent advice that I think everybody will and should follow.
So April 1993. This time we're not going to do the writing on the body parts. I think that's a kink for some people. So we're gonna leave it out of the show.
Probably a good idea.
First up, there's some game that had something to do with King Arthur, and you said Renaissance in regards to King Arthur, which Carl, you know when the Renaissance was, right?
I know, but in this game they have gunpowder, so it didn't really matter. It's clearly they threw the King Arthur name on a game that already existed.
Possibly. And there's that one that Enix of America did. I'm trying to remember what the full name of that was. But then all those devs went over to Square in America, and then they did Secret of Evermore. Fun little connections there.
Interesting.
Then, on other convoluted developments, Croc was not a 3D Yoshi game. Dilly Dillon of Gaming Alexandria followed this up in a script for Did You Know Gaming. It's in one of the episodes. We'll put it in the show notes. But basically this idea that the Croc and the 3D Yoshi pitch to Nintendo are not related games. Basically.
Okay. So they basically pitched it first and then decided to develop something completely separate.
The idea is that, Croc is a green character with a big nose. It's like obviously they were just developing this and then they swapped out Yoshi for their original character. But the character goes back much further than that. And I'm sure whatever little technical things they did on their demo, they carried forward when they went to the PlayStation idea. But the Croc game was not developed out of the Yoshi game. People who actually worked on Croc have not said that.
Okay, gotcha.
Interesting. And of those people who worked on Croc, his name is Jez San. So if
I keep getting that wrong. I've had to say it several times already, and I keep getting it wrong.
Well, maybe that's why he hasn't come on the show, Carl. I kid.
Yeah, at some point I'll have to get him. We'll see.
Yeah, and I would be super stoked if that happened. So, Jez-san, please come on the show. I know you're listening. Then we jump to arcades, even though people want to pretend like the arcades don't exist in 1990s. And your statement that the arcade has, quote-unquote, been in decline for over a decade is not accurate, because the arcades topped out again in 1989 in terms of income, revenue, and new machines sold since 1982. So it has not been a complete decline over that entire period.
Gotcha.
And as usual, we can... Ups. Yes, and then precipitous downs, but, that happens. And we will link my sales article in the show notes, in which I compiled all the information on both console, arcade, and the limited number of handheld sales over the decades of revenue, income, and units sold.
Gotcha. And that, dear listeners, will be in the show notes.
Yes. Last up, what comes next? Next. And the next computer actually did not launch in the 90s. It launched in 88.
Ah, that's true. It did come in very, very early.
And around for a decently long time, and used to develop Doom, so we can all be thankful for that.
That is true. They did use it for that. Although, I mean, the hardware is taken over by 93, so it's 5 years.
It is, yeah. All things go, Carl. All things go.
This is true. Nothing lasts forever.
Just like the Department of Corrections, even though it feels like it sometimes. You are set free, Carl. Return to your regularly scheduled programming.
As we will, and as always, Ethan, thank you for your service.
Yeah.
I mean, that was pretty good. I mean, pretty good track record there. I do want to just pile on a little bit on the arcade thing, but it's not your fault, because this is actually something that a lot of people get wrong, because the narrative that is in a lot of the mainstream sources is that, there was the golden age, and then there was the crash, and then arcades were dead until Street Fighter II came along and revived them. And the reason I think that happens, I mean, I can't speak for these people. One of them's Kent. I can never speak for Kent. But I think it's because you had massive hits in the golden age, like these defining games like the Pac-Mans and the Space Invaders and the Donkey Kongs. And then outside of maybe Double Dragon, you didn't have any defining hits in the later part of the 80s, and then suddenly you had Street Fighter 2, you had Mortal Kombat, you had NBA Jam, you had Daytona USA. And so people just look at that kind of progression of the hits, and they're like, oh, well, everything was in decline until Street Fighter 2 came. Well, no, it's actually what happened is that after the craziness of that golden age and that coming down from that high, what you got was a more balanced kind of arcade scene where you had several video games that did really good business, but not like tens upon tens of thousands of units business. And you had several pinballs that did very good, and you had Redemption coming in. And so you had a balanced market that was, at least in the United States, was rising in revenue through like 85, 86, and on up to 89. And then things got out of whack again, where in the early 90s, you were back to this kind of hits-driven business again, where you had individual games that were doing this gangbuster business. But unlike in the golden age, you didn't have this rising tide of these big hits lifting all boats. So the arcade actually in the U.S. peaked around 1989 again, and then started to decline, just as you had these big headline-making games coming in again. But even though Street Fighter II was doing tens of thousands of units in NBA Jam and Daytona USA, it was only the hits that were selling, and so these massive outsized successes couldn't stop the decline of the business as a whole. But I think that's why people miss the 80s resurgence, is that outside of, like I said, maybe Double Dragon, there's just nothing in that period that you can grab onto and say, oh my god, that was a huge, amazing hit.
And that's true. And I guess it also didn't help that it pretty much gets relegated to the arcade again. Your arcades, your bowling alleys, the ever-presence of arcade machines in your supermarkets, in your convenience stores and so forth, that's gone in that second half of the 80s. So it also stops being something where the average everyday person, that crossing over where, people are just going to throw a quarter into a Pac-Man machine doesn't happen any longer because they're not going to the arcade.
Yeah, that's absolutely fair.
And that probably also fuels then the idea of the super hits, because these are games like Street Fighter 2, like NBA Jam, where practice is going to make perfect. The big hits tend to be competitive games at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to go to the places where you can find other people to compete against, which is not going to be your 7-Eleven and so on and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. And once you get into that cycle where the games that make money are only the games that play to the hardcore, you can only put them in a place where the hardcore will meet. And now you're missing out on that whole casual player demographic.
Absolutely.
So, yes. Oh, okay. So sad. We missed out. All those people who could have been gamers. What will they ever do? Will they ever find their way back? Oh, yeah, they have cell phones. Okay, now. And the microtransactions will make more money than arcades ever possibly could have dreamed of. But that's still far, far into the future.
That's right.
Well, in that case, then, I think it's time to turn on the time machine and make some new mistakes by traveling back to May of 1993.
Kid to point a gun at a television set.
Welcome back to May of 1993. Alex, what's our first story?
Well, Morici to unify Capcom.
Morici.
Okay, it is Chi. I didn't know if he did the Italian pronunciation or not.
Yeah, he does.
Even though I've interviewed him.
He'll never correct you, but if you ask him how to pronounce it, he'll tell you Morici is the right one. But he's completely cool with you mispronouncing it.
It is the right one. I'm just so used to Americans not pronouncing their Italian names correctly that I assumed the other way. So let's try that again. Morici. Here we go. Morici to unify a Capcom.
Friend of the show, Joe Morici, has been promoted to the newly created position of Senior Vice President of Consumer and Coin-Op at Capcom USA. The goal will be to create a more unified approach to marketing titles in both the arcades and home console business to give the company a more, quote, uniform look.
Yeah, I mean, this is a period when Capcom was in real transition. I mean, they almost go out of business in 1994. It's on the cusp of getting bad for them. And I think there's a realization here that the Street Fighter thing has carried them about as long as it can in the arcades, and they really need to kind of figure out how to move forward in both of those spaces. And I think it's a recognition that the home is where they're going to have to kind of put their big effort into going forward. Because, of course, he was the person in charge of consumer before he was in charge of both, not the person in charge of Coin-Op.
Exactly. And this was something that I talked to him in my interview with him. And he had pushed, for example, to get, well, we'll talk about in just a moment, Street Fighter onto the Genesis much sooner. And the idea that there was money being left on the table. I mean, friend of both of ours, the gaming historian, oh crap, now I can't remember the gent's name. Guy who does the YouTube channel.
Norm,
thank you. Yes.
You said that, and I was deer in the headlights. It's like, I actually have met him in person. Yeah, it's Norm.
Yeah, Norm. Norm just recently did a video, or last year did a video about the PC versions of Mega Man, which Joe was instrumental in getting started, because he was always looking for more opportunities to expand the use of Capcom's IP. And so it makes sense to put him in charge of this, because you're right, they need to get onto consoles where everything is going to make real money. And yeah, Capcom is going to have to make that transition.
And they certainly are, because as you hinted at, Capcom brings Street Fighter to Genesis.
Sega fans can finally enjoy the beat-em-up phenomenon that is Street Fighter II with Street Fighter II Champion Edition.
Yep, you mentioned this. So we've both interviewed Joe Morici, and I'm sure he said the same thing to you that he said to me, is that he would bring this up all the time, and Tsujimoto would just say, "It is not yet time for Sega."
Yeah.
And of course, Capcom's an Osaka company, and I mean, a lot of the Japanese third parties were very loyal to Nintendo, but there was something about being fellow Southerners that created even more of a bond between Nintendo and Capcom. You've got it's in most countries it's the South. In Britain it's the North. It's the opposite. But in most countries it's that South that always has that stereotype. And I'm just talking about stereotypes. I'm not talking about reality. Disclaimer for your listeners. But there's, just as the American South has kind of this stereotype of being backward and hayseeds, the South of Japan, Osaka and Kyoto, are considered to be kind of the less sophisticated hayseed area. And so, I think there was this real bond of solidarity between them, standing up to these, fancy pants Tokyo companies. And but it just got to the point where they were leaving too much money on the table. And despite that bond, they had to do something.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, especially in the United States, that was just too big of a market for the Genesis. And especially given the demographics that Sega had been targeting with the Genesis, it was just so perfect for Street Fighter II. I mean, they had been going for the edgier people since the very beginning, and so you want those teenagers who want to beat the crap out of each other. And, well, There's other games coming to the Genesis that are going to be pushing that even further, and they couldn't wait until Mortal Kombat got there first.
Yeah.
Because that would have just really hurt their margins.
And yeah, I mean, it killed them. I mean, obviously Sega still had a good 1992 in America, but it killed them having Street Fighter II exclusive to the Super Nintendo that year. That game, and we know this for a fact because Capcom has actually, put out their figures for all of their games that have sold 1 million or more units. That thing sold over 6 million copies. All on the Super Nintendo, because it was exclusive to that system. And that's Capcom's official figure. Worldwide, 6 million, I think like 6.3 million. And even if Sega had only captured a third of those sales for the sake of argument, that would have been a huge boon to them. I mean, that was a real loss for them in 92. So this is more of a consolation prize, obviously. The whole Street Fighter II concept is a little long in the tooth by this point. It's about to be overshadowed on console in some ways by Mortal Kombat, but it's definitely a sign that even Nintendo's most steadfast loyalists cannot afford to ignore that Sega system anymore.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, we've talked about it. We've seen the slow evolution of Nintendo lose its hold over the last 2 to 3 years on the show. How they've had to make more and more concessions, either because of the U.S. federal government breathing down their neck, because of market pressures, because obviously the retailers aren't, happy with just having one company run the whole thing. And, Street Fighter II coming to the Genesis, now basically all bets are off. The third parties are off the leash.
Yep. There's really only one segment that they never have to worry about, and that's in this period, and that's their RPG stalwarts, Square and Enix, because of course the Japanese companies are really making these decisions based on the worldwide market pressures, and those Japanese RPGs, Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, just aren't that popular outside of Japan at this point. So there's no need for them to go multi-platform. Obviously, that final peg will be knocked away from them come next generation. But yeah, sometime this year you'll also be reporting on Konami finally putting their games on the Genesis as well. This is really the opening of the floodgates there.
Yeah. But, that's not the only tool in Sega's toolbox.
Oh, God. That's right, because Sega explains blast processing at CES.
Sega's Winter CES press kit tries to explain, according to Video Games and Computer Entertainment magazine, the concept of blast processing, which, according to Sega, quote, the blast processing mode on Genesis, the total power dedication of the Genesis system to giving a character on screen a blast of speed, guarantees the quickest power punch delivered on a 16-bit system. It's like kicking the system into turbocharge, end quote. Apparently goes on to explain that it's really just harnessing the 7 megahertz of the Genesis CPU.
And in reality, it's not even that. So blast processing is completely 100% made up. But we do know the story behind it. So there was a technical guy at Sega of America, Scott Bayless. And at one point, I think it might have been when talking about the Sega CD. Obviously, they're applying it more generally to the Sega Genesis here. He was talking about how it was possible, if you did your timings really well, to do a DMA interrupt on the DAC, digital analog converter, as part of like the video processing stuff, to send an interrupt in between the drawing of scan lines, and as a result be able to put up a 256 color static image on the screen by using this interrupt. And he described that as blasting the DAC, because you're sending that DMA interrupt at just the right time. And the marketing people got a hold of that phrase that he used and came up with the idea of blast processing. So when they say blast processing, they're not even talking about the process that Scott Bayless was talking about. They just liked that word blast and then, just applied it in this way that it literally doesn't exist. It's just marketing gobbledygook. But, it was a way of capturing the idea that the Genesis did have a faster CPU than the SNES. I mean, that much is true.
Oh, definitely, yeah. I mean, and you also see it in a lot of the sports games. Anything that needed to use a lot of sprites on screen was going to be a better game on the Genesis. But yeah, this is a terrible idea. Now, tried to figure out exactly when blast processing was first introduced into the marketing. First ads apparently for Sonic the Hedgehog 2 in late 92 already had blast processing show up, but on the Gaming Alexandria Discord, we couldn't come to a conclusion definitively when it first shows up.
And that would make sense because since Scott Bayless was talking about the whole blasting thing in the context of the Sega CD, even though, like I said, that's not how they used it at their marketing ultimately, it would make sense that it would be late 1992 after Bayless had a chance to play around with prototypes of the Sega CD. Of course, the famous commercial is the Mario Kart commercial, the race commercial. But yeah, I don't think that was quite the first one, just the most famous.
Yeah, I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And remember, everybody, all our sources, everything we're talking about, there's links to it down below in the show notes. So yeah, but we know now they're trying to justify it somehow in the marketing at CES, and it's nonsense. So
that's right, but that's not the only channel Sega's blasting over, because Sega is to offer games over cable.
Sega has announced the Sega Channel, which will allow owners of a Sega Genesis to download games directly to their console over existing over existing television cable connections. This service, which will charge a monthly fee, will allow cable operators to get into the much-touted data-providing business without the cost of moving to digital cable technologies, according to TCI, the company that has joined with Time Warner and Sega to launch the channel.
Yeah, I mean, the Sega channel is an incredible what-if scenario. Because it's actually a pretty sound idea, even in its own time. So many of these, like, download services were, especially the ones that we've looked at in the 80s, they were too far ahead of their time to be practical. But in this case, we're talking about cable, which even then is a fast enough medium to download relatively small Sega Genesis games in a reasonable amount of time. And, in its initial version here, we're not talking about playing online. I mean, it would have been really interesting if they had expanded into online gaming. We're just talking about having games available and, being able to download them, which was a reasonable expectation for people's bandwidth at the time. And it was only $13 a month, which, it was more back then, inflation and all that, than it is today. But, when you think about, your Xbox Live gold memberships that, get you a variety of free games a month. I mean, that's pretty reasonable. I realize you get more for Xbox Live Gold than just that, but it feels like a reasonable price, and they were going to offer a robust catalog of games every month. They got big third parties signed up. Obviously, they had their own Sega games. They got EA and Activision. So it feels like this is something that could have worked. The problem is they couldn't get it ready in 93 or even 94. It wasn't ready until 95, and by then, nobody was interested enough in the Genesis anymore to pay for that kind of service. And Sega Corporate was not so enthused about supporting it anymore because they were already moving on to the Saturn.
As somebody who had a buddy back in Seattle back in 95 who had the service, I remember going over to his place, and he had, I think it was Earthworm Jim 2 at that point was one of the games. And, I mean, it was this really cool idea that you're going to be able to download it, play it, don't have to buy any more games. There was always something on there. There was also, I think, some bulletin board services or some other thing like this added to it. It really was, like you said, a great idea. And it also plays interestingly with a lot of the chat that's been going on in the coin-op magazines about how the telecommunications boom is a potential threat to them. I mean, what happens when you can have a jukebox with 20,000 songs and the songs are coming over, these data lines? Where, we've got the new president, Clinton, coming in here, and Al Gore is talking about, data connections and building up data infrastructure around the country. These are all plans that are in the zeitgeist of the time.
And Time Warner had already launched an interactive cable service in Florida. Time Warner and Sega were really the real drivers of this, even though TCI is the one doing this specific announcement. TCI was another cable company they brought in as part of a three-way deal just to have more coverage for the service. But it was really Sega and Time Warner that got together and got this thing started. And Time Warner had been experimenting with interactive cable already, which is what made it appealing to them.
Yeah. I mean, it all feels like we're on the cusp of something new. A cusp of a new way for all of this data to go back and forth. And nobody's quite sure, what the form is going to be, what the method of transmission is going to be, which infrastructure is going to win out. And everybody wants to be in at the beginning, but of course, first mover advantage only helps you if your technology is actually out on time and actually does what you need it to do. And curiously enough, on the side note, Nintendo has announced a similar plan to offer games and other content over satellite in Japan for the Super NES starting in late 94. Unfortunately, they too will have problems and the system won't launch until April of 95, which again is a little late. Yeah.
Exactly. If some of these things had come out in 1992, and I mean, they weren't ready to yet. I mean, the tech wasn't quite there yet. If these things had come out in 92, or if the console generation had just been slightly shifted so that, the 16-bit era was more, extended to 95, 96 instead of, the transition to the new generation, this might have started something. Because it was actually a legitimately good idea, unlike some of the other, digital distribution services that had been dreamt up in the past. But it was just ever so slightly out of time. And then, the market took twists and turns away from this kind of thing until, of course, Dreamcast and more significantly Xbox and Xbox Live started coming back around to it.
True. I mean, yeah. What could have been?
And speaking of what could have been, because this was definitely the period of the also-ran console, we have the Marty announced.
The makers of the FM Towns computer, the Japanese 386 technology-based computer, is getting a console edition, the FM Towns Marty. This 386 SX chip-based system will sport 2 megs of RAM, a CD-ROM drive, a floppy disk drive, and have a modem add-on for games such as Habitat. The Marty will not be compatible with current FM Towns games due to ROM differences, but future FM Towns software should be compatible across both platforms.
Yeah, I mean, this was part of a real trend, and we saw it, in the US too with things like 3DO. But there's kind of this idea that multimedia and the emerging internet is going to transform the market. And this for a lot of companies in Japan, I think this felt like kind of a last desperate chance to get out from under Nintendo's thumb. Because you see, I mean, obviously this is a computer company coming into the console space, but you also see just about every one of the Japanese major publishers either considers or puts out a console in this period. Taito, Namco, Konami, Capcom, Bandai, they all do it. Like, a couple of them don't release, like Konami never releases theirs, but everyone either looks at it or thinks about it. Because I think there's this feeling, especially in Japan, that the internet and multimedia is going to be a great leveler that will allow them to hone in on what so far in their home country has been a Nintendo monopoly. And of course, it just doesn't quite work out. But I think that's kind of the best way to kind of contextualize where this whole Marty idea is coming from.
Oh, definitely. And I mean, they're not the only ones. Just the year before, we saw Commodore release the CD-TV, so they converted their computer system into a console.
Yep.
It just makes kind of sense if you've got an existing technology base to do this. The only problem is, of course, a computer is a very different price point. This thing is going to be expensive as all hell.
Yeah.
It's going to be like $800, similar to the 3DO in its outrageousness. And unfortunately, that's just not the right price point. You need to make sure that a console has a lot of bang for very, very little buck.
Exactly. And the technology just moved too quickly in this period, because one thing that, it's easy to forget about when looking back in hindsight is, in this exact period, nobody outside of literally just Ken Kutaragi at Sony, nobody believed that polygonal graphics were coming to the home for at least another 4, 5, 6 years. And so kind of the exciting technology that everyone thought was going to take off was multimedia, perhaps also paired with the internet. And it just turned out that polygonal graphics were closer than anybody realized. And so you got this hard pivot away from these expensive pie-in-the-sky multimedia systems, because it's like, why am I going to spend $800 for this multimedia system when I can spend, in Japan, $300 roughly for a PlayStation that does sort of polygonal graphics. It's like this is a moment where everyone thought the technology was going one direction, and it just went in a completely different direction and left everybody not named Sony holding the bag.
That's very true. I mean, you're right. Ken Kutaragi sees the future, knows he's got to go in that direction, and well, we'll get to it when we start talking about the PlayStation, but the compromises he makes in the design of the PlayStation, just the straight integer numbers, that little jumpy graphics thing is so brilliant, so that I could gush forever because it's such a beautiful design. I love the aesthetic of the original PlayStation. Mm-hmm. Heck, I just played Wipeout 2097 again yesterday because I keep going back. There's something timeless about that system's graphics that just keeps pulling me back in. Whereas if you try to play Alone in the Dark on a PC nowadays, it's painful.
Yeah. I mean, there are very few points in history of anything where like one person or one paradigm shift was truly instrumental in changing the course of everything, because most of the time technology is inevitable and you have multiple people researching the same thing, and yes, one person gets here first, but the other person was probably just a couple of lucky turns away from being the guy instead. But the PlayStation is one of those points where it really was like, without the team at Sony, without Kutaragi's vision and the team he put together at Sony, things would have been very different. Would polygons have happened eventually? Well, of course they would have. I mean, even the Saturn was going to have some ability to use geometric solids in games, but nobody else thought that was coming at that moment. But that's why you see all of these pie in the sky. Like if the people of Fujitsu had realized that something called the PlayStation was going to come out with those capabilities in 2 years, they would have never tried to go down this path. They would have seen it for the madness it was. But at the time, it looked like this was the future. And it looked like, yes, this is going to be expensive right now, but grab the early adopters, and then the buzz will build, and then the price will come down, and this is the future direction of the technology, and we will be poised to capture it. And then, whoops, everyone took a hard left turn into geometric solids via the PlayStation.
Exactly. Well, and we're going to see. I mean, there's going to be other people trying to figure out ways to bring us into the 3D realm without that. But, yeah, we're going to get to that.
But right now, we are still in this multimedia Sillywood period, which is why another big announcement of the month was Return to Zork to come to 3DO.
Activision has announced a deal with Trip Hawkins' 3DO company to release their upcoming PC adventure game Return to Zork for the new Super Console.
I mean, why not? It's Sillywood at its finest. And there's some silly wood in Return to Zork, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, and the sad thing is, this game does not get released.
Right.
It comes out on every other conceivable platform. It comes out for the PlayStation. But it does not make it to the 3DO. And, I mean, at this point, the 3DO hype train, we've been talking about it for almost a year now, is in full swing. But Trip is having a terrible time getting those third-party titles on the system.
Yeah. It's just not worth anyone's time to port it there. I mean, they announce all these deals because, of course, everyone's like, yeah, we'll say we're committing to porting our game to your system because, nobody's going to care if the system flops and then they don't port the game to their system. I mean, so exactly. It's cheap to announce a port. Might as well do it and see how things go because Trip is a visionary. And Trip has a reality distortion field, maybe not quite as powerful as Steve Jobs, but still pretty powerful. And so he had the industry, I think, really believing for a time that this might be the future. And so he at least had them believing enough that they were happy to do business with him. Which, again, is a marked contrast from Sony, where I know, but it's you know, it's appropriate to the conversation because at first they could get nobody to commit to making games for their system because they're like, come back to me when you've sold 1 million units. And then Sony was like, well, we won't be able to sell 1 million units if we don't announce your cool titles. And they were kind of caught in this loop for a long time. 3DO avoided that, I think, solely on the strength of Trip Hawkins' ability to sell product. But of course, it almost all ends up being vaporware. None of it actually materializes.
Yeah, I mean, and most of the stuff that does materialize is, well, just ports of existing software. I mean, EA is his big coup. The fact that EA does support him, however, I've heard his accounts of it, you know, where he suddenly realizes, oh wait, I'm not in charge of this company anymore. I don't necessarily have sway here anymore, and I always found those extremely interesting.
He is. I've interviewed Trip a couple of times, and he is very candid in interviews with giving his perspective. And from his perspective, he really feels that Electronic Arts stabbed him, and Larry Probst stabbed him in the back. Because yes, they did do a commit to the 3DO, but they also, kind of like the way Trip himself, you know, it's kind of ironic, kind of the way Trip himself committed whole hog to the Amiga and then did an immediate pivot when it turned out that the Amiga was not making the splash in the United States that it needed to support the software it was making. EA, once they realized that the 3DO was going to flounder, they pivoted hard away and into the PlayStation and didn't really fight for the 3DO as a platform. So even though they were there at the beginning, there was still a point where they broke with Trip, and Trip really, I think, felt that because he had founded EA and it was still up through 94, the chairman of EA, felt that they should have essentially acted as a first-party developer for 3DO, and they didn't. They pivoted hard, and of course they ported everything to other systems.
Yeah. And now, granted, when you really think about it, they put a lot of money into that system. We'll talk about some of the titles later, like the version of Wing Commander 1 that comes out on there with all new graphics, all new effects, all new sound. Yeah. I mean, that had to have been an expensive undertaking, and I'm sure it did not pay off.
Yeah, and the Road Rash with the music licensing and Soundgarden and all of that. You know, they did video stuff with Madden. No, they made the commit, but the betrayal in Trip's mind was that they then pivoted from that commit.
Yeah, I hear you. But, absolutely. I mean, yeah, once you release 3 or 4 big titles and it doesn't make you any money.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, that is just Trip's perspective. And I can understand. I can see where he's coming from. But at the same time, EA made the business decision they had to, just as Activision, to bring it back to where we really are here, I suppose, ultimately makes the business decision they have to, which is like, maybe we'll sit this one out.
Well, I just checked Moby Games. They did bring one title to the 3DO, and it was a Mahjong game. Shanghai Triple Threat.
Ah, of course. Which I'm sure was relatively cheap to port over. I mean, the Shanghai series was hugely successful for Activision, so that stands to reason. But yeah, they're not going to take the effort to turn their AAA Return to Zork game over to the 3DO because it is just not worth the effort.
Nope.
And speaking of cutting back, we move on to handhelds now, where Nintendo launches Bare Bones Game Boy.
The standard Game Boy package, including Tetris, a link cable, and headphones, will now sit alongside a standalone Game Boy offering on store shelves. The original configuration will set you back $80, while the new slim version will cost only $60. Peter Main of Nintendo says that the reason for this move was the success of the Bare Bones SNES that was offered last year.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense at this point because, you know, when they were first selling the Game Boy, there had never been a truly successful handheld video game system. I mean, Game & Watch taken as a whole was successful in Japan and parts of Europe, but like an interchangeable system, I mean, there'd really only been Microvision, and, you know, it hadn't been successful. So they had to sell like the value of the Game Boy when it first came out, because it's this boxy thing with a terrible screen. And so how do they sell it? Well, first of all, Tetris, which is like, it's like it was created for the Game Boy. It wasn't. But if you told someone in the future that didn't know any better that it was, they would 100% believe you. Second is that, yeah, the screen's janky, but we have stereo sound. But you only get the stereo sound, because there's only one speaker in it, I believe, if you have headphones. And so they wanted to pack the headphones in with it to show people that you at least get amazing sound, even if you have a crappy screen. And then, of course, the link cable, the ability to play with other people. So, like they had to have a complete package to, like, demonstrate the value of it. By 1993, everyone knows the value of the Game Boy, such as it is. I mean, sales are starting to decline because it's an older system, and Pokemon hasn't arrived yet. But you don't need the bells and whistles for people to understand what a Game Boy is anymore. And so it kind of makes sense to have a lower price point, entry point, to try to jumpstart sales of a system that are starting to slow when you don't need all of that stuff necessarily to hype the system anymore, so to speak.
Well, that, and I think it was probably also an image problem if you have your new 16-bit Super Console costing less than $20 more than your Game Boy.
Yeah, that is also a problem, and we talked about that in our special Crash episode, how the value proposition of consoles, when consoles came down so much in price, that destroyed the value proposition for software. And yes, I think you do see the same thing going on here, just with dueling hardwares instead of software, where if your high-end system is barely more expensive, then where's the value proposition there? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
The optics.
But big competitor in the handheld space, Sega, is not going to take this new challenge sitting down. Oh no, because Sonic brings Game Gears to Hojo's.
Hotel chain Howard Johnson has teamed up with Sega for a summer promotion. Those staying at the hotels over the summer can get free use of a Game Gear and games for the system during their stay, as well as activity sets.
I think it's so funny because, of course, the Game Gear is supposed to be the portable system. It's the system that you're supposed to bring with you to the hotel because it's the system you're playing in the car ride, on the plane ride. But of course, you can't play Game Gear in a car. You can't play Game Gear on a plane. Not unless you're also bringing 50 batteries with you.
There is some truth to that, more than some.
But I do find it a little funny that, like a portable system being offered at your destination. Like, don't you need the portable system to pass the time while you get to your destination?
Well, it's more like, mom and dad want some time off, so let the kid play.
I do understand.
Yeah. But yeah, I get what you're saying. I mean, the Game Gear has some technical issues.
Yeah, no, I understand the logic here. I find it funny. It's kind of like, this is a little silly. But
I mean, well, when you really think about it, the Game Gear is what we were talking about earlier with the reappropriation of hardware from one use to another use, and it doesn't really work. Had they just designed new hardware instead of just cramming a master system into this thing, it would have been a different ballgame.
Yeah, absolutely. But, the future isn't in Game Boys and Game Gears and video game systems. That's not where the future of portability lies, Carl. The future of portability lies in PDAs, because let me tell you, the PDAs are taking CES by storm.
The winter CES in Vegas saw a battle of the PDAs. We probably need to explain for the younger viewers what a PDA is. A personal data assistant.
All of the companies were just kissing each other right on the show floor.
PDA can also mean public display of affection.
This is true. Sorry, now I'm just imagining Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. Okay. And there's Jack Tramiel sitting on the sidelines. He's like, when is my turn?
I always said business was like sex, but I didn't mean it literally.
He likes it rough. It's like war. Okay. I'm going to burn in hell for that one. Now, after Apple announced the Newton at the summer CES in 1992, AT&T has shown off their personal communicator 440 at Winter CES 93, and Tandy has once again teamed up with Casio for the Zoomer Personal Information Processor. The personal communicator has the standard pen-based interface, but can also be linked to a cellular phone or a landline for transfer of emails or sending of faxes. And it only costs $2,899.
What a steal.
Yeah. Tandy Zoomer uses an OS from GeoWorks, handwriting software from Palm Computing, and has a ROM version of AOL's software for online services. And it'll even get its own version of Quicken. While still just a prototype, it's estimated to give 100 hours of on an alkaline batteries, better than the 2 hours offered by AT&T's device, and cost between $600 and $1,000. The Newton is expected to sell for under $1,000.
Oh, there is just so much of the time in that paragraph.
Oh my goodness. But yeah, I mean, this was considered, it's kind of like multimedia and the internet. It's like PDAs were considered the future for so long. I even remember when I was in college in the early 2000s, PDAs were still supposed to be the thing that revolutionized our interaction with data in the workplace. And of course, we needed the smartphone, just like, multimedia was supposed to take over the world, but it was really what we needed was the internet. PDAs were supposed to take over the world, and what we finally needed were smartphones. But there were so many attempts in the 90s by so many companies, and of course Apple's Newton becomes just a joke of a thing. But they're not the only ones that went down this dark path.
Yeah, and I think the AT&T one is the closest to a properly thought out idea. Mm-hmm. The technology is not there because you don't have the battery life. I mean, 2 hours of battery life. Yeah. But the pictures of this, and I'm taking all of this from an issue of Popular Electronics. And the picture of this thing is they have it sitting on a base, which is clearly connected to a telephone line. Mm-hmm. And has an antenna on it. So it's basically just like the control panel on an executive phone that you can just detach and use as a PDA and then hook back up when you're ready to send off the email that you wrote on it. Mm-hmm. And I mean, all of these collapsed for the same reason. They're still trying to do handwriting recognition as opposed to just give me a keyboard. I mean, BlackBerry figures that out. Just give me the keyboard.
Yes.
Apple then takes that and says, well, we don't always need the keyboard. We can have a bigger screen. We'll just flash it in when necessary.
Yes.
And that solves that problem because nobody bothers with handwriting recognition. It's just too slow in comparison with the keyboard.
Exactly. And yeah, throw in the battery life issues, and it's just like, no, they may be taking CES by storm, but they will not be taking the world by storm.
No. Although I did like the fact that the OS for the Tandy one was coming from GeoWorks as a old school C64 user.
Yeah.
It was nice to see GeoWorks is still trying to play a role at this point.
Right. But even though PDAs won't end up taking the world by storm, we have some other things coming up here that I think just might, because I hear a little game called Doom got previewed.
German magazine PC Player previews id Software's latest creation, Doom. While the screenshots only show 2 weapon types and no enemies, it does reveal that you can switch between a full-screen view and one with heads-up displays on the left and right, including a real-time map and weapon status. No Space Marine graphic yet present, but the fact that this will revolutionize 3D gaming is clear.
It's coming. I mean, there's not a huge amount to say at this early state, but I mean, of course, id has been hyping it and will continue to hype it for a long time because they are definitely one of the developers that first kind of pioneered this kind of staying in close touch with their fan base. I forget exactly when Carmack started doing his .plan files, but even before that, they were getting on BBSs and hyping up, and we're already saying, you thought Wolfenstein was cool, just wait till you see what we're doing next. And so, it's just to say, well, they have a lot more to say on this one come, I don't know, December, but, or maybe January, since it's based on when there's coverage as opposed to when things actually release. But suffice it to say, it's coming.
Oh, definitely. Now, there are some interesting tidbits. Like I said, the heads-up display that's depicted there looks nothing like the final heads-up display. The fact that it's got the map on the side and stuff. Couple of tidbits from the article are interesting because they talk about how the game is supposed to follow 4 Space Marines to an alien-infested station. There is one screenshot in there of 2. In your view, you see 2 other Space Marines. And so the whole big thing about playing co-op, which kind of hints back to what Romero wanted to do with Quake originally.
Right.
The Space Marine sprites are in one shot. At this stage, the game requires 4 megs of RAM, but they hope to get it down to 2, which I don't even know what the final requirements were on it. That's something to look up.
4 was a lot back then, let me tell you. I know that sounds like a pittance, but 1993, 4 megabytes was a lot.
Yeah, it would have really, really hurt to have 4 megs in the system. But then again, hey, it was Doom who really cared, right? You were gonna upgrade for that thing.
Oh wow, this says now. This is just pulled off a random internet site, so take it for what it's worth. But this says that it actually required 8 megabytes of RAM when it actually launched. But
8 megs.
But that is
now, I'm looking
not
at
necessarily true, because this
box.
also says the OS was Windows 95, and that's a lie. So
now,
maybe the Windows 95 version
Doom
required.
95. That might be Doom 95. Now, I'm looking at the GT Interactive boxed edition of Doom, scanned on Moby Games, and it says 386 is required, 486 is recommended, VGA graphics card, hard drive, 4 meg of RAM minimum.
Okay. Yeah, I think I saw the Doom 95 requirements, which would make sense. So they did not get it down.
No. They tried, but they did not get it down. Of course, anybody reading this preview is praying that it's going to get down to that. And this was the part that really caught me. The article says that the game will be released commercially as opposed to shareware like Wolfenstein was. Yeah. A claim seconded in this month's editorial for Electronic Games. Now, this is one where I'd have to go back and reread Masters of Doom.
Yep.
But considering that Spear of Destiny came out as a commercial title, independent of Apogee, I'm wondering, was their contract with Apogee still in place that they had to release a shareware version through Apogee? Or was this, in fact, the case that at this point in time they did not have a contractual requirement to do it through shareware? And is it possible that they really were considering only doing a commercial release of this game?
And my Masters of Doom is last read is too far in the past to remember exactly as well. I know there were some internal kerfluffles where Mark Rain, who was only briefly there, but went on to bigger and better things at Epic, but was briefly at id, was really trying to push them out of the shareware market and into the retail market. but I think he was already gone at this point. Like, I'm pretty sure the Spear of Destiny thing was something that he kind of, if I'm remembering correctly, which was the retail Wolfenstein, was something that he kind of put together without really consulting with everybody. I think that was part of why he left, if I remember correctly. I'm speaking off the cuff a little bit, but I think Rain was gone by the time of Doom, so I don't think he would have been the one pushing this. So I don't know.
We still have quite a ways to go. But like I said, in the editorial in Electronic Games, it kind of sounds that way. And also the fact that the German preview is clearly stating this will be a commercial product. It will not be a shareware product. Kind of makes me feel like, okay, maybe they're making that statement before getting the sales numbers for Spear of Destiny, and then they maybe have gotten scared. Because I don't think Spear of Destiny sells quite as well as they would have hoped. But I honestly don't know. I'd love to get some inside dope on that decision.
Yeah, and Masters of Doom might have it. I mean, it's a pretty detailed book. I just don't remember off the top of my head.
And who prepares for these episodes? I mean, come on.
I can't prepare for every eventuality.
Exactly. This is my vacation. I prepare for my podcast, and then I just come on here and spout random stuff that sometimes bears some vague resemblance to the truth. It's great.
Nobody's listening to this anyway, so you're all good.
But yeah, computers are getting bigger, faster, more powerful. That 4 megabyte of RAM requirement there. Doom's gonna set new benchmarks, and it is a time where computer technology is shifting, and it's right in the middle of this as well that the first Pentium systems ship.
2 years after Intel sent out the specs to select PC manufacturers, the first systems from companies like IBM and Dell will finally be shipping with the Pentium processor. While bumps are expected, many vestigial flaws of earlier PC architectures, like slow buses, are expected to be a thing of the past, and lightning-fast speeds are expected.
Yeah, I mean, of course, this is, when Intel really started upping their consumer marketing around the Pentium. The whole Intel Inside campaign and all of that really started around here, and this was the point where, my family, just speaking personally, finally kind of jumped on a more advanced computer system. My parents had never, updated computers religiously. They weren't technophobes at all. It's just they weren't gamers, so they didn't need to have the latest hardware. And so I believe our previous computer was even a 286. I don't even think it was a 386. But we had bought our previous PC in 1986 or 1987. Oh, wow. And yeah, I didn't play many PC games in the late 80s, early 90s. But in 1993, we did upgrade to a Pentium. And that is when my era of PC gaming really began. Was at that point, and it's the period when a lot of people were really. I think it's the period when the general public were starting to upgrade to the latest and greatest systems more than they had in the past, because it was the first time it was really marketed to them, and with the internet and multimedia and this kind of confluence. So. This was a milestone moment for sure, though we got a Micron computer. We did not go through Dell.
You should have done it like I did in '96 with my first machine. I went to some little chop shop in Gainesville, Florida, and had them put it together for me.
Nice.
And yeah. But
I build my own machines today, but not back then.
Yeah, I stopped.
It was a lot harder back then.
Ago.
Plug and play made the process of building hardware just a little bit easier than it was back in the day.
Well, now you're jumping ahead because that we're going to be talking about that here in just a moment.
Yeah, well, so we are.
Yeah,
we are, but not yet, because we got to stay fixated on Intel for a little longer. This is Intel's time to shine. Next up, some court drama. It's the same old story. Intel sues AMD. Those scamps are at each other's throats again.
Oh yeah. Intel has filed suit against AMD for their AMD 486 line of chips, as well as their unannounced Cleanroom 486 re-engineered chips. AMD said that the suit was not unexpected and that they expect to win in court. So yeah, the whole reason to call it a Pentium and not a 586 it comes up here. So the AMD 486 line are the ones that they're building under their old license, and the new complete Cleanroom 486s are the ones that hopefully will replace them soon so they can get these lawsuits off their back.
It's gonna be a while before there's no longer existing litigation between the fine companies of Intel and AMD.
Oh, definitely.
But in the meantime, with all of these exciting Pentium announcements, Intel sees its stock soar.
Since 1990, when the stock was hovering around $40 a share, Intel has seen a meteoric rise to $120 a share by the end of 1992. The ever-increasing adoption of PCs by both businesses and home users, and the speculation of big profits to be gained in 1993 from the launch of the Pentium promises to keep the chip maker a hot stock to watch.
They will see those big profits on Pentium for sure. This is the height of the Wintel alliance right here. You know, perfect storm of multimedia, making people feel like their children need computers in the home for education. Plus, more and more people taking their work home with them, and so needing a home PC for work, combined with all the cloning, particularly from Far Eastern companies, really driving down the price. And now Intel coming in here and deciding to become a savvy consumer marketer for the first time to kind of take this whole cauldron and stoke demand even more. This is where you really start getting that mainstream penetration of higher-end PCs.
Oh, definitely. And I mean, there's also a worldwide expansion due to the beginning decline of all the other home computers. Mm-hmm. I mean, we've talked about it, all the 8-bit contenders are out of the market. The 16-bit contenders are beginning to drop like flies. Atari's basically out of the market. So there's not a lot of competition left.
And not just the computer makers, but the chip makers. Because companies like MOS and Zilog and Motorola fail to make that leap out of that 16-bit processor era and into compelling 32-bit chips. I mean, MOS and Zilog didn't even get to compelling 16-bit chips. But, Motorola was kind of neck and neck in a lot of ways, even though Intel even then was a 32-bit processor. Like, there was that lower tier of home computer that, really embraced the 16-bit processor and of course, video game systems as well. And Motorola was kind of neck and neck as a chip maker with Intel, but they couldn't bridge that gap to those more advanced processors. And Intel's starting to leave everyone in the dust on the chip side as well.
Yeah. And let's face it, that idea of small jumps that you can make while maintaining compatibility is the key to success. All the other systems, every time you have to upgrade, you're basically screwed. And there's a story, I didn't add it this month, but for example, the CD-TV that we already mentioned, there's a story this month that people are starting to figure out, oh wait, that CD-TV I bought that they were advertising is basically an Amiga computer with a CD drive. If I add a disk drive to it and a keyboard, isn't really that way because it has 1 meg of RAM in it, and most Amiga 500s had 1 meg of RAM at this point. But you need a certain portion of that 1 meg of RAM as buffer for the CD drive. They didn't add extra memory for the buffer. Mm-hmm. So any software that requires the full meg of RAM will not run on the CD-TV off of disk, because it simply doesn't have enough RAM to run it. And there's no way to upgrade the RAM in the CD-TV. It's a closed box. It doesn't have an extra hatch for RAM expansions. So, you know, I know this is slightly peripheral, but this idea of if you're going to upgrade the system, you have to make a big jump. You have to leave compatibility behind. Intel doesn't have that problem. Everybody else does, but not Intel. Mm-hmm. Or Wintel, I should say.
Yep.
But,
absolutely.
Pain in the ass. Okay.
And speaking of that Wintel alliance, Plug and Play coming to PC.
Microsoft and Intel have announced a plug-and-play mechanism for ISA-based PCs. Gone will be the nightmare of switches, jumpers, and IRQ conflicts. The hardware will cost vendors an extra $5. Other vendors like Microchannel and EISA Systems have offered plug-and-play for a while, even the MSX had it, but this would be new to the legions of PC-compatible users out there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big deal. If you didn't live through this era, you have no idea how hard it was to upgrade anything in your computer. I mean, even for a couple of years after this, because it's really, you know, when you get into Windows 95 and software plug and play with the appies and you know, plus then PCI and PCI Express and all of that it truly gets easy. But this is easier because, yeah, setting jumpers, not fun. Even if you are tech savvy, not fun.
No, just a pain in the goddamn ass. And yeah, I mean, I still had a little bit of problems with this when I did finally upgrade. I remember having to set the jumpers on hard drives. I remember having to set the jumpers on anything legacy. Oh my Lord. Try to get an old, anything that was old in there working was a pain in the ass. But, you know, that is slowly going to disappear. The machines will slowly get more user-friendly. And, well.
Yep. A good month. A good month, yeah. A good month for the PC compatibles. A bad month for the Mac compatibles, for they have arrived too late.
That's right. NewTek has finally released their Mac-compatible chipset. The project has taken 4 years and should now lead to Mac 2 VX compatible machines that run $500 to $1,000 less than the real deal. Still, the chips won't run the Mac OS, and compatibility with software covers, quote, almost all, end quote, of the most important software, except for Photoshop, Excel, and Works. So, yeah, this thing is coming out just as the only reason to buy a Mac. Quark, Express, and Photoshop are getting ported to Windows.
And you can't run Photoshop on the compatible anyway. Yeah.
Bingo.
Yeah. And of course, in a few years, Apple will make the decision to have officially licensed Mac compatibles, and that's going to work so well for them.
Yeah, because it's, I mean, the whole reason, why would you want a Mac compatible? Mm-hmm. If you want to be a Mac user, you're asking to pay too much. You want to pay too much. You will feel lesser if you're not paying too much.
You'll feel like you're getting cheated if you're not paying too much.
Exactly. Now, NewTek has also announced the Duet system, and that will run both MS-DOS and Mac software through a multi-processor system. Another innovation no one needs. So, it doesn't make any sense.
New tech, more like poo tech.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it, I think, last month, how Photoshop is finally getting ported to the Windows machines.
Right.
Basically killing the whole need for this. The moment you can run Photoshop under Windows, game over. At least if for the budget conscious. But yeah, it's Macs. who cares? No.
Absolutely. But that's not the only place where trouble is brewing, because there are layoffs hitting computer game makers.
Sierra, Microprose, and SSI all saw layoffs. 60 at Sierra, 30 to 40 at Microprose, and 17 at SSI.
Yeah, I mean, Sierra, it's one thing and one thing only, and that's the Sierra network is killing them in this period. Killed their profitability there for a while. Noble effort that didn't pan out. SSI and Microprose, I mean, they're finding something that a lot of computer game companies are about to find, which is about to spur a huge wave of consolidation, which is that the technology is getting more complex, the engines are getting more complex, the games are getting more complex, you need more people to make them, you need more time to make them because they're so complex and there's so many bugs to squash. They don't have the time that they need to make them because they have to keep money coming in, and so they release them too early, they release them buggy, and so we're starting to see some of the companies in the computer game space just come up against the reality of what they can accomplish at their size with the technology of the day, and it's going to see a lot of these companies in the next few years disappear as they get bought up, merge, etc.
Well, and I think there's also another element, especially for these three companies. All three of them are stuck in a mold where they have not diversified their portfolio, and they're stuck primarily in genres that are not growing. When I talked to Al Lowe, he explained it was, when they started out, there was a specific number of people who wanted to play adventure games. The kind of people who liked problem solving, because those were also the people who bought the early computers that were a pain in the ass to use. As more people are adopting machines and are less tech savvy, they're also, the number of people buying the adventure games did not increase proportionally with the new machines. And like you said, the cost of making the games is going up. Microprose at this point has just had a couple of major flops. Rex Nebular, which cost them a fortune to make because they had to develop their own point-and-click adventure engine. Mm-hmm. And Darklands, where they spent a ton of money developing an RPG, two genres that they really had no foothold in. But they saw them as genres where you had to make some money, that you could make some money, have both flopped. Those are major investments. And as Wild Bill Steely says, they also missed the deadlines for major titles, including F-15 Strike Eagle 3, missed Christmas.
Yes, as Wild Bill likes to tell the story. And this is, again, just his perspective,
of course,
because he had to take a leave of absence from running the company. He said, when he left, they put everyone on what was he said? They put everyone on overtime for the first time, and so they just spent all of their time getting paid and not finishing the game. I think it was overtime. He says that they changed the way that they pay people instead of paying them basically they made more money the longer the projects went on. And in Wild Bill Steely's view, that meant that they just let the projects go on and on and on and didn't finish them.
Well, when I spoke to him, he said he left some MBAs behind to deal with it. When he came back, they had basically not pushed them hard enough to get the product out by Christmas.
Yep.
And SSI obviously has the problem that the Gold Box engine, which they've been relying on for far too long, has gotten way too long in the tooth. Their big cash cow as of late was Eye of the Beholder, and Westwood Studios has just left, taking, the talent with them that was also one of the big innovators with, different types of games being developed by them. And so you're dealing with companies that have not realized the future of PC gaming are the Wing Commanders and the Wolfensteins of this world. And they're not ready for that future yet. And
absolutely,
that's going to bite them in the ass really hard.
I mean, Sierra's diversifying more than the others, though. Sierra's problem at this point really is the Sierra network. They would be super profitable and be having no problems right now if they hadn't made that investment.
Yeah.
But for microprose and SSI, absolutely. It's absolutely what you said.
Yeah. Yeah. And we'll talk a little bit more about, I think we have another story about TSI coming up.
TSN,
yeah, TSN, yes. But, and it's curious because there was an article, I can't remember, I think it was in Questbusters, about the Game Developers Conference. And at the Game Developers Conference, there was a booth. They were looking to hire more people for TSN. But, TSN is just a money pit at this point.
Yeah, Ken Williams really, really wanted it to succeed because, he did see a future there. It's just that future wasn't going to build in the way that he was building it. They were basically running a network of ordinary PCs attached to the outer world by one very, very tenuous T1 line snaking its way into the Sierra Nevada foothills. There was just no way. He was right that networked gaming and online gaming was going to be a future, but this is like the mad scientist version of trying to make that happen. and
when I interviewed him, that's exactly what he was talking about, is like the realization that he could not keep the company in Coarse Gold anymore.
Yeah.
Came too late. That he held on to that dream that Coarse Gold was going to be the location, trying to make Coarse Gold this technology hub was never going to work. And when he finally hired a consultant and asked him, hey, why can't we get, top executives to come in? He's like, because you're in Coarse Gold.
Yeah.
That's it. But there's also a rumor, according to Questbusters this month, that Sierra might be bought out. And I think we're about around the time when those conversations are going on. It's somebody's going to be investing heavily in the company. Now, I can't remember exactly when that happens, when Sierra gets bought out.
It's a couple of years later.
It's a couple of years later, yeah. But I can definitely see why those rumors are flying at this point in time.
Well, this was about the point when the failed Sierra Broderbund thing happened, right?
No, that's already we've already covered that. That's already in the past, I think.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that has already been taken off the table.
Yeah, never mind. That was 91. That was way back when.
Yeah. Like I said, that one's already taken care of. But
no, it's Broderbund's failed merger with Electronic Arts that's just around the corner.
Okay. See, there's all these failures yet to happen.
Well, it's no surprise that there'd be rumors, though, because this is the period when consolidation starts happening, and it is just because being in a single niche isn't enough anymore, and expanding out of your niche into other niches is just becoming too prohibitively expensive. Look at Microprose, which correctly recognized that they needed to expand out of their niche and then fell on their face trying to do it.
Well, and that's it was such a risky thing, and both of those projects were so bad. Have you ever played Darklands?
Very, very incredibly briefly.
Yeah, me too, and that was enough.
Yeah, pretty much.
No, the sale to CUC International is in 1996.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it was really only right before that because, as I'm sure Ken told you as well, he wasn't really even looking to sell at that point. They just made him an offer he couldn't refuse.
Exactly. And he also thought it would, boost the company. And according to him, at least, it was a very big disappointment. And, well, we know.
He named his book, Not All Fairy Tales Have Happy Endings. So I think it's fair to say he considered it a disappointment, yes.
Yes, but, just a little bit.
But on the other side of the pond, things are looking great as Commodore clocks in big in the UK.
Commodore is gushing over its 1992 year-end numbers in the UK. According to market share auditor DataQuest, Commodore sold 18.9% of all new home computers in the UK in 1992, dwarfing their nearest competitor IBM, who only sold 7.9% of the country's machines. The last quarter saw that percentage jump to 27.3% of all new machines, thanks to brisk sales of the Amiga 600 at 200,000 units and 44,000 units of the Amiga 1200, which was only on the market for 2 months. On the whole, Commodore moved 390,000 machines in 1992.
That's great, guys. How's your North American branch doing?
Yeah, the North American branch keeps running ads in Byte magazine trying to convince people that the Amiga 4000 is a good idea. I can tell you, though, this month they expanded them to also include the 1200 for the first time, which tells you a lot, because the 1200 wasn't really meant to be, it was just the home machine. And they're just, they've completely ignored it so far in the advertising in North America.
Yeah, but no, I mean, the UK team, they did a great job. And Commodore was still ruling the roost there in this time period. And when the whole show goes belly up a couple of years later, the UK management team did try to buy out at least the UK branch, if not more, because they were actually still going strong even as the wider company was going bankrupt.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and you can tell there's a niche still in Europe because consoles have not taken off.
Exactly.
There is a niche for these cheap machines, and this is what we were talking about earlier with you have to upgrade the whole thing. The Amiga 1200 is the one that brings in the new AGA chipset, basically gives you VGA quality graphics. It's upgrading the CPU. It's slightly less compatible, but you have to just basically chuck the old machine and buy a new one. Their big problem here is that Amiga 600. Because the Amiga 600 is still the old tech. This is going to cause a lot of confusion with people. It's going to cause a lot of confusion in the market. The game developers are going to be like, well, do I develop for the 600 or for the 1200? We're going to see big games, and we're going to talk about a company here in just a minute where, you've got this top-of-the-line game that is going to be not using the 256 colors, so they don't lose out on that market. It's kind of sad. I mean, but yeah.
Yep, but they're still living high for the moment, at least on the Amiga. On the other hand, the future of C64 game software looks bleak.
In a sign of the times, aka the end of 8-bit home computers as a viable market, Commodore Format Magazine has revised its scanner feature, in which it shows all upcoming releases as if they were on a radar, by adding budget re-releases to avoid having less than a dozen new games on the radar.
Yep. Yeah. And now the end is near.
And so I face the final curtain.
Indeed.
Yeah. They still managed to have 6 new commercially released games to review this month, but it's clear that there's just nothing new in the pipeline.
Yeah. I mean, in the US, the fate was sealed as soon as the NES came around. Obviously, in Britain, it held on longer, but even at this point, you're probably going to have an Amiga 600 rather than a Commodore 64. I mean, the Amigas have come down enough in price on the low end that there just isn't a place for that 8-bit stuff anymore, even in Britain, Europe.
Yeah. And it's curious, if you look at Compute Magazine in the US, they've got ads for Commodore machines in the back. And if you buy a Commodore 64 with a disk drive, it costs you the same as an Amiga 500 that has the disk drive built into it.
Yeah.
And the fact that they're still selling C64s at this point, even in the States, tells you something about where the market is. I mean, there's still users for it, but there's just not enough of them to support new software development. It's just over.
Absolutely. So, time to move on to the Amiga. At least that's what Binary Asylum thinks. as Binary Asylum formed.
3 former game journalists, Andy Wilton, Bob Wade, and Andy Smith, have formed Asylum, later changed to Binary Asylum, a publisher looking to release, quote, high-quality, end quote, games with the Amiga as the lead platform.
A little late to the party here, guys.
Yeah, and this is the reason I bring them up is twofold, because their story of a poor transition to the PC is classic. And we talked about this in one of our 10-year jumps years ago, how they basically go under. They were doing a game called Star Trek New Worlds, I believe, or Strange New Worlds or New Worlds. It was an RTS with a Star Trek license, and it built slightly off of the 2 games that they would make for the Amiga, Z-Wolf and Z-Wolf 2. Excellent games. Again, not using AGA graphics, just using the standard graphics, but designed to actually run on an A1200 from a CPU speed. So it's this weird compromise where you're not really going to run it on A600, but you could if you wanted to in order to keep the market share large enough. But that also kept the graphics and everything downgraded enough that there's no point in porting that to PC or any other system.
Absolutely.
And yeah, they're going to fall apart. They're not going to make the release of the RTS game, and another studio is going to come in very quickly, salvage what they can, and the game that comes out is basically forgettable. And that will be the end of Binary Asylum. But, okay. And I also said it because I really, really love the Z-Wolf games. So I thought,
I figured with this one that you always sneak in at least one story with a personal connection. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's your podcast.
That's what I'm here for.
Exactly. But now we are moving on to some online news, starting with cable providers move into information services.
Yes, DEC and LAN City Inc. have announced a new technology to allow for Ethernet connectivity across existing cable TV wires at a distance of up to 75 miles. And this is basically just, the infrastructure is there. And I almost put the Sega channel thing down here in the online, but it seemed more important for the console wars.
I agree.
Topic.
I
but
agree.
This idea that the potential new powerhouses in computing, or at least services for computers, is going to come from cable providers and telephone providers is extremely important, because these guys haven't really done much with their technology since the 1960s. I mean, cable hasn't really evolved other than, you got decoder boxes so you can't see boobies on Skinamax. But now they are really putting this in. There seems to really be this drive. Whoever cracks this code first is going to be sitting on a gold mine, in conjunction with the Wintel machines permeating everybody's living room.
And unfortunately, the one that cracked the code was Comcast. The answer was Comcast. And we're all sad.
Very much so.
But no, that is a great point, because this is a big paradigm shift that's coming, where the infrastructure companies start having way more clout than they could have imagined.
Oh, definitely.
Years before.
Definitely. And we can go into the whole debate about how they got that clout and how the infrastructure, especially in the United States, developed over the decades, and compare it with other countries. But here, you've got a lot of relatively small operators all trying to figure out how are they going to do this.
Yep, absolutely. Meanwhile, the big player is going to another route as TSN teams up with AT&T.
American telephone giant AT&T has signed a letter of intent to buy a portion of Sierra's online service, TSN. This capital injection will help expand TSN's offerings.
Yeah, it's a money pit, and of course AT&T will end up buying the whole thing eventually.
Yeah,
making the Imagination Network. Just makes me think of South Park now. Imagination, imagination. But yeah, I mean, AT&T recognizes that this is going to be a future that they want to be a part of, and spoiler alert, they do very much become a part of it. But obviously, the TSN itself is not going to end up being the vehicle for that, because it is a money pit that is, as I mentioned before, a series of network desktops in some mad scientist approximation of a network connected to the outside world by one tenuous T1 line coming into the Sierra Nevada foothills.
It's pretty messed up.
It's insane. But, more power to them on vision. He was definitely boldly going where no one had gone before. And speaking of boldly going,
nice
no
transition.
One has gone before.
My
Interplay locks down, thank you, Star Trek license.
After the success of their 25th anniversary game, Interplay has signed an 8-year deal for use of the original Star Trek license for video games across all platforms.
It's just too bad 25th anniversary was the high point of Interplay's foray into Star Trek games.
Yeah, I mean, and this is a weird period because you've got Simon & Schuster has the next generation license for multimedia products. You've got Spectrum Holobyte has the next generation license for computer and console games. You've got who ends up with the Deep Space Nine license? Happens around this time as well. I can't remember. Somebody's got the Deep Space Nine license. You've got Interplay here with the Star Trek license. So you're going to get a flood of games that have no consistency in planning, no consistency in style, or just, how are they supposed to fit together? And while you get a couple of interesting products from Interplay, like Judgment Rights, like the PC version of Starfleet Academy, you're also going to get the console version of Starfleet Academy, which is a slightly mixed bag. It just feels so random, but Interplay is really trying to figure out what the hell is their role in the market in a console-dominated universe.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's weird, sad, and I still wish somebody would find all the files to Secret of Vulcan Fury, because I think that there's a movie to cut together out of all of that.
Indeed. And speaking of things that just end up being weird and sad, Shaq signs with EA.
Star NBA rookie Shaquille O'Neal has signed a deal with Electronic Arts to have his likeness used in video games. EA, leaders in sports star licensing with games like One-on-One and the recently released Jordan In-Flight, are already busy working on a game for the Super NES and Genesis.
Yeah.
I wonder what this game's going to be.
Yeah, I've spoken to Don Traeger, who was at this point the executive producer in charge of all the sports licenses and whatnot. And I was like, so, Shaq Fu, huh? And he was like, yeah, we were doing some more inventive things with Michael Jordan. And, Shaq didn't want to be left behind on that. So, he wanted us to put together a project, featuring him as well. And we all know how that went. But, I mean, very savvy of EA to recognize that Shaquille O'Neal was worth signing. I mean, yes, he was already a star, and yes, he was gigantic. I mean, it wasn't that huge a leap. But still, he was at the beginning of his career. So.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, he's very, very early in the career, but it was already clear that he had a certain amount of personality, a certain amount of just attitude that was going to make him different from Jordan. I mean, if you play Jordan in flight and it's, Michael Jordan giving you pointers on the game and stuff, it's sort of that fatherly figure a persona that he had about him, and making Shaquille the guy who's fighting zombies with a basketball or something, whatever happens in that game is just interesting.
And speaking of fighting game crossovers that made absolutely no sense at the time, Street Fighter action figures debut.
Yeah, I got nothing to say here other than that Ryu doesn't really need a beach comber with a chain gun mounted on the back.
Yeah, so I have a little more to say, actually, this time. So this was right at the end. So, because these were actually released as G.I. Joes. This was a license with G.I. Joe. And this was right at the end of me still buying action figures from time to time.
Oh.
I was just young enough. So, I do have 2 of these still in my parents' basement somewhere. I didn't collect all the Street Fighter ones specifically, but I think Guile and M. Bison I have. Even at the time, I mean, I was almost done with action figures anyway, so that didn't help. But even at the time, I thought it was pretty dumb having Street Fighter figures in G.I. Joe. That just did not seem like universes that shared particularly well. But I do have a small amount of experience with these things.
Gotcha. And I was already out of it at this point, but I do remember seeing these and just wondering what the heck were they thinking? And I think the vehicles were just repaints of existing Joe vehicles.
They were, yeah. The one there is the old Dreadnought Thunder Machine in that one picture. And then...
Yeah, and it is kind of funny because I think it's the original figures, the original release of the figures have the G.I. Joe logo on them, but then later versions, they just get re-released as movie figures.
Yeah, this is at the very end. This is at the very end of G.I. Joe. So 93 was the last year they kind of released a full suite of figures, and they released a small number of figures in 94, and that was the end of the Real American Hero line. They relaunched as collector items a few years later in 1997, and there's been intermittent releases since, mostly targeted the collector market. But yeah, this was right at the end of the G.I. Joe line. G.I. Joe was my action figure jam as a kid, so I bring all the knowledge on the Joes. So that's why they ended up getting re-released without the G.I. Joe, because they were winding down the G.I. Joe line.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes a whole lot more sense. And I just saw that they also had a play set. Wow. Okay, that's just so weird.
I agree. Even though I did buy a couple of them, even I thought it was weird at the time. I wasn't particularly excited about it, though. Like I said, I had one foot out the door on action figures by that point. I was not the core demographic. I was on the older end of the action figure demographic. So
there you go. And I mean, yeah, action figures, they have their place. My jam was He-Man, so I stuck with He-Man, and then moved over. Did GoBots. GoBots was my jam. I had little to no respect for Transformers because of all the kibble. I didn't understand. It was like, why would you go with these cheap toys where Optimus Prime, you have to put the little hands on him for it to transform? Leader One doesn't need that. It also helped that where I lived in Argentina, we did not get the Transformers cartoon. We only got GoBots on TV every day.
That's fair.
So
yeah, no, I was a G.I. Joe man. Now, I mean, I had some Masters of the Universe. I had some Thundercats. I had some Ninja Turtles because I was, I'm a little younger than you, so I was still in the action figure phase when Ninja Turtles came along. So, and I had a couple of masks. I had at least one thing from almost every action figure line at the time. But G.I. Joe was my jam. That's the one I had dozens and dozens of them, and lots of the vehicles and play sets and whatnot. watch
That's
the cartoon.
totally legit. Totally legit.
Yeah, watch the cartoon, have every issue of the Marvel comic, which was legit good, by the way.
Oh, no, very good. Very good. I've actually gone back and reread a lot of that. I mean, my first contact with it was the Special Missions.
Yeah, yes, and those were more adult as well. Those were particularly good, the Special Missions.
Well, those were the ones that you could pick up without having to read the whole thing, and you just, enjoy the issues. I was a big fan of the Transformers comic, which, the early years were hit or miss with a lot of it. Later on, when they bring over the writer from the UK, it gets really, really good. But that's another issue. Okay.
Absolutely, because we're not here to talk about 80s action figures. We are here to talk about computer retail. And Computerland cuts back.
Computerland Corporation, the early heavyweight in PC retailing, has cut 220 jobs at its headquarters and received $17 million in cash from its three biggest investors.
Need specialty computer stores anymore.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that we're 10 years after Tramiel brings the VIC-20 to Kmart and Computerland is still somehow surviving is already a bit of a testament to, cool. But, I mean, they're going to get a few more years, but it's really sort of the end already.
Yeah.
Their highlights have come and gone.
Yep. Big box retailers and mail order. Lots, Dell really pioneered that, but lots of people just getting their computers in the mail, not even going to a store to get them.
Well, I mean, considering how fast PC hardware is changing, moving stuff from a manufacturer to a retailer, especially a retailer that's not also a manufacturer, like, for example, Radio Shack.
Right.
Just means that by the time you get the stuff, you can get a much better one through a mail order. You're not stuck with inventory that it will have virtually no value because of the obsolescence factor.
Yep.
It just doesn't make a lot of sense.
Absolutely. I have no good transition here. Sometimes they just run dry, so I'm just going to say it. I'm just going to come out and say software industry enlists USTR to fight piracy.
The United States Trade Representative, the agency in charge of policing unfair trade practices, has been asked by a group of over 70 software developers and publishers, including Nintendo of America, to take action against pirated games coming from Taiwan, Venezuela, Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, China, and more. The industry estimates that it loses over $2 billion a year due to piracy.
So did you get raided down in Argentina? I don't even know if you were still in Argentina at the computer store at this point.
I'm already out of Argentina. I left Argentina in December of 91. And we did not have any raids to my knowledge in 93. But yeah, I mean, the fact that Argentina was included, I always consider quite cool. A friend of the show, Guillermo.
Our illegal activity got noticed. Hooray!
Yay, exactly. Guillermo Crespi of the Modo Historia podcast, where you have also been a guest.
Love him. He's a great guy. Great
guy. Yeah, I'm in relatively constant contact with him these days. He's a really nice guy. And we were talking about some of this, and there's a great quote from the head of Spain's biggest software company at this point, Dynamic. And he had done this tour of South America, to see, how's the industry. And he's talking about all these different countries, Venezuela and stuff. And piracy is, of course, a big issue. But he says, but when I got to Argentina, piracy was on an industrial scale. It wasn't just, people passing games back and forth in the schoolyard. You guys had proper stores and distribution and magazines and yeah, we did. So yeah, this is fun. But yeah, the fact that Argentina got listed as one of the countries together with Taiwan and China, obviously Argentina is not exporting the stuff the same way, but
Right, yeah. but they've got their own local market totally in the thrall of this ecosystem. Yeah, no, Guillermo, whose name you say a lot better than I do, but he's done a lot of work on documenting a lot of that industry down there, which I think is wonderful. Somebody, whether it's him or somebody else, somebody needs to write a book about that someday, because that is a very interesting market for the way that there was not just piracy, but like you said, this piracy on an industrial scale that was.
Well, he interviewed me for it because of my small contributions back in the day, and he has an upcoming episode where they're going to be talking about piracy in Argentina in this era, in the 80s and early 90s. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing all the people that he talked to for that. So,
excellent
fun stuff.
But it's not just the developing world where piracy is gathering all the headlines, because UK court expands software copyright protection.
A UK court has decided in favor of a programmer who, after leaving his employer, John Richardson Computers, developed a PC software package similar to the one he had written for his employer. JRC did not claim he copied any code, but made a look and feel argument. The court ruled that, quote, screen elements widespread throughout the industry should be ignored, as should features that represent the obvious or only real way of fulfilling a function. Remaining elements were then deemed copyrightable, end quote. Considering the recent implementation of a European-wide copyright law, which we covered a few episodes ago, this new UK decision, seeing as this point they are still part of the EC, the European Community, could be cited by other courts in the European community.
Man, don't tell Steve Jobs about this one.
Yeah. So again, Europe is always a little bit behind. We've talked about some of the weirdness with copyright law, how German magazines are running ads for copy devices for game consoles and stuff like that, brazenly in the open, even reviewing the devices in the magazines because there's, loopholes for making your own backup copies. All of that is still allowed under European law. They're a little bit further behind from what you would find in the U.S. law. So I thought this was a cool decision that really got to some of the core concepts, defining what the copyright was going to protect and what it wasn't going to protect in the European, at this time still the European community.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's wrap it up with a little pop culture, or what passed for it in 1993, as Super Mario Brothers hits theaters like a derailed freight train.
Not the worst analogy. On May 28th, the Super Mario Brothers movie hit theaters and the world rejoiced, for it was, well, a movie called Super Mario Brothers.
I can't remember if I mentioned this on this podcast before specifically, but I mentioned other places. I saw this right when it came out. I saw it with several of my friends. My mom was the one that drove us all. And so, she, unfortunately, great mom, had to sit through the movie as well.
Ooh, she sat through it.
Yeah. And just afterwards, she sat further back, so the kids could all be together without mom, hovering around them. So afterwards, kind of walked back, and just kind of looked at each other, and it's like, yeah, and she's like, yeah. And we both knew. Words did not really need to pass between us to understand that this was a movie that was not going to endear itself to adults or children.
Yeah. Now, fortunately, was living in Europe at the time. This movie, as far as I know, if it got a release, it was a very small release. Super Mario Brothers was not really a widely known property at the time.
Right.
And I do remember seeing preview images of it in magazines, but, you know, it never showed up on my radar. I knew that it was bad. I didn't actually watch it until many, many years later. This must have been around 2008, 2009. Somewhere on my old Twitter account, there's a live tweet of me getting drunk while watching it and just wondering what the hell am I watching. I'll have to look that up someplace, see if I can find the series of tweets. But yes, it's a terrible, terrible movie.
Yeah.
That's really the only way to put it. It's
apparently the script, the original script, was amazing. Like, they signed Bob Hoskins. The story of the making of this movie is in the book Generation Xbox, which covers the kind of intersection of Hollywood and video games from the beginning up until, you know, the point the book was published, which was like a decade ago now or something like that. Not just like movie spinoffs, but also, you know, things like interactive movies, like both ways on this. And there's a chapter dedicated to the Super Mario Brothers movie. And apparently the original script was amazing. Like, they got Bob Hoskins on the strength of that script. Like, he wasn't blackmailed into it, and he wasn't doing it because, like, his grandchildren loved Mario and he wanted to do a movie that they could see him in. Like, he signed on the strength of the script, and so did a lot of other people. And then, you know, I won't tell the whole story. Go read the chapter in the book. It's very interesting. But basically, the people making it were in over their head. They couldn't wrangle the production. The studio kept getting colder and colder feet because it was a kind of bold take, to put it mildly, on Mario Brothers. And so what looked amazing on the page in the very beginning got watered down, cut up, refigured, reshot in such a way that it's just a nightmare. And you know, there is an extended version of it now that was restored by fans. We did a watch party of that at Gaming Alexandria. It makes parts of it slightly more coherent, but it doesn't make any of it better. Sorry, Kate. Kate Willett will go to her grave defending that movie, but
somebody
but no.
has to, because Lord knows look, it's not going to be me.
I can respect the big swing.
Okay.
Because it was a big swing to do a radical, gritty take on the Mario Brothers story. But, you know, just because I respect the big swing doesn't mean that I feel they were actually close to hitting the ball. You know, I mean, I can't defend it. All I can say is it probably would have been more interesting. Would it have been good? I don't know. But it probably would have been more interesting if we had actually gotten to see the original vision of the filmmakers. But,
well, I mean, the whole concept of the parallel universe with the dinosaurs that evolved into people was still in the original script, right?
Probably. I mean, I assume so.
No, that doesn't save it. Then it's. I mean, the problem is if you're. I have to think here. I'm thinking here of the way that Weird Al Yankovic in an interview once described the process for doing his polka medleys when he had to adapt rap lyrics to the polka medley. Because rap doesn't have a melody that he can then adapt into a polka. He said turning a normal rock melody into a polka, it's basically a mathematical equation.
Right.
But when you don't have a melody, you basically have to invent one for this. And Super Mario Brothers, and not Mario Brothers, but the Super Mario Brothers franchise has no real melody. There's no explanation for any of the nonsense.
Right. Absolutely.
And so you have to invent that for the movie. But the problem is that what they did here was they invented an excuse for why two plumbers would be in a fantasy world. Their explanation, though, doesn't lead them to the fantasy world of the games.
Right.
It leads them to a completely different fantasy world, which now there's no reason to make it a Super Mario Brothers movie if there's not going to be them landing. Now, if you came up with a good excuse why they would be in this fantasy world, or make the fantasy world they land in, aka a fantasy world where anything goes so you can have, all the nonsense,
right.
Which is my understanding. I haven't seen the new movie yet, but that's basically what the new movie does.
Basically. Meanwhile, these guys are like, we'll build our own Mushroom Kingdom with blackjack and hookers.
I was wondering if you're going to pull that. I love that reference.
And it so fits. I mean, it fits even more than usual in this case, because there are hookers.
Yeah. There are hookers with flying boots. I mean, it's with jetpack boots.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. I mean, and you can totally tell it's the same directors that did Max Headroom. It's so Max Headroom.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go figure.
Gosh. But the sequel they tease at the end sure looks exciting. We're getting that any day now, right?
It's just like Frank Langella coming out of the muck at the end of Masters of the Universe going,
right.
I'll be back, or whatever he says.
Right. It's like, about that.
Yeah, something tells me that may not happen, but, just in case it does.
But on the other side, in the news of pop culture figures who are totally coming back, despite what you may think, sometimes I got it. Superman is dead.
In January, Superman died. And now, Wizard Magazine, in the most comic speculator bubble moment possible, is celebrating the character with a, quote, really intense Dan Jurgens gatefold cover and crushed die embossed over silver mirror board. I have no idea what any of that means, but I've seen a picture of it, and it looks like we made cardboard glitter.
But was it intense?
I guess I can't take Dan Jurgens' artwork from that period seriously. I mean, it's just the composition doesn't work really well for me. I mean, Dan Jurgens is a competent artist, just does not click for me, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, this event was so ridiculously over the top. I mean, I did not read comic books outside of my beloved G.I. Joe. I mean, I knew superheroes, of course, but I did not read comics. But I mean, I knew about the Superman thing. I mean, the mainstream news, reported on this stuff, and it was clearly just, a bubble moment, like you say here. It was clearly just so that they could have a bunch of new issue number ones and have this limited collectible miniseries, and then have a new issue number one and juice the market, because that's what the comic book market was all about in this period of time, was having as many issue number ones as you could get your hands on, with as many different cover variations as you could possibly make. I mean, I know this is, Wizard Magazine's cover, that we're talking about with Jurgens here, but, because they had all the Superman successors that were temporarily going to be vying to be the new Superman. And of course, they all got their own covers on the miniseries. And, looking back, it is the worst of early 90s comics excess, which got pretty darn ridiculous.
Oh, yeah, I know. And when I read this, I was just like, okay, I've got to talk about it, because it does create a certain backdrop for all of the other pop culture that we're talking about in video games, for example. I mean, Blizzard is going to come out with the Death of Superman video game here at some point. And it's to give also an idea of what other activities are competing for video game dollars in the youth market at this point. Because, I mean, when you're looking at a Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat, these excess things, the extreme culture, which is fueling stuff like Bubsy. It's fueling stuff like Mortal Kombat. And, the Superman, getting pummeled to death with blood everywhere and stuff. There's a certain air about all of this. I mean, Shaq Fu, for God's sake.
Yeah.
It's kind of just indicative of the moment and gives a little bit more perspective.
It was a weird time looking back. Let me tell you, it was also very aggressive back then. I didn't, as a kid then, I did not feel aggressed upon at all. But looking back, it's like, man, everything had to be really intense in the 90s for some reason.
Yeah, I guess, why was that? I'm sure that this has been psychoanalyzed to death, and I'm just not seeing it, but...
Gen X had a lot of feels they needed to feel.
That's true.
I'm right at the end. I'm usually classified as a millennial, though.
Yeah.
I'm either the first year of millennials or last year of Gen X, depending on where they cut it off. But...
Yeah.
Gen X was kind of an isolated, alienated group by, lots of broken homes and divorces, and I don't know myself, but Gen X had a lot of feels they needed to feel, I think, and it all came pouring out in the 90s.
As a member of Gen X, who, unlike many in my generation, did not have a broken home, did not feel outcast, but did in fact feel this whole, it really was a feeling of something is changing. And it wasn't, your social upheaval of going out. It was the technology was changing, the way people interacted with one another, the angst about how you were going to make money in the future, not knowing what new change was coming, where every time you looked around there was news about some major change to the way of life or the speculation about what was coming that really made you start to question a lot of those basic tenets that you were hearing from your parents about, what is a good investment. This is, people buying freaking comic books thinking that, this comic book that everybody's got a copy of is going to be worth something someday.
Exactly.
I had a buddy who did that. He had such a collection of nonsense, all the Image crap. And,
yeah.
It was like, why? Who cares? It was like one to read and one to keep in folio. It was like, dude, you're wasting your money. But oh well. It could be worse. So, I think that is the end. We have reached the end of the line. We have told all the stories and reported all the news that we wish to report. So you now, Alex, our intrepid co-host, have one final task. You must decide the word of the episode.
Yes, a very sacred charge. It's got to be blast processing. I know it's only one story. It doesn't really tie the whole room together, but how can it not be blast processing? One of the most iconic nonsense phrases. It does actually tie things together, because same with the Superman is dead, the Street Fighter action figures. There's a lot of ridiculous, over-the-top marketing tie-in nonsense going on this month, and nothing encapsulates that. Game Gears are coming to Hojo's, for God's sake, and nothing encapsulates that ridiculous marketing tie-in nonsense we covered this month more than the height of all ridiculous marketing nonsense, blast processing.
I'll take it. I love it. So, where can our dear listeners find your fine work?
Well, they can always find me over at theycreateworlds.com, and there's links to the podcast there, but the podcast specifically also at podcast.theycreateworlds.com. Of course, I have my book. One of these days, I may even have a second one. Knock on wood. Ha ha ha. Which is They Create Worlds, the story of the people and companies that shaped the video game industry, Volume 1, which is available from direct from the publisher, CRC Press, as well as major online retailers.
Excellent. And remember, everybody, links to everything are in the show notes. You can also follow us on Patreon, just $1 a month. And if you do have any comments for me, just send me an email, videogamenewsroomtimemachine@gmail.com. Okay, so with no further ado, have fun.